Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, tonight we're very privileged to have Will Greene as our speaker. He's a well-known Civil War historian. Additionally, he was the director of the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, the director of Pamplin Historical Park and the National Museum of the Civil War Soldier in Petersburg, Virginia. Additionally, he was appointed by President George W. Bush to serve on the National Oversight Board for the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Additionally to that, as if he didn't have enough to do, he has been writing numerous books and over 20 articles. He has also he's been on 10 different C-SPAN lectures and panel discussions on Civil War topics. Very, very knowledgeable and with a most interesting topic for tonight. So let's all give a warm welcome to Will Greene.
All right, is this working? It sounds like it's working. Thank you, Ann, for that generous introduction. And I want to thank you for all of the nice arrangements that you made for my visit with you. I think this is my 5th time to this roundtable, and I have to say that I'm always blown away by the huge crowd that you have. You should be very proud of this organization. And I'm particularly pleased that you're here on this auspicious night. Now, you've probably heard both the candidates say this is the most consequential election of our history. And I think the people in this audience know there might have been a couple more that were a little more consequential, maybe 1860 and 1864. And we're going to be talking about 1864 today, and particularly about a cavalry raid. Next slide, please. Now, some of these cavalry raids made a big impression on military campaigns. For example, this fellow, Earl Van Dorn, destroyed the supply depot at Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1862, postponing Grant's move on Vicksburg for more than 6 months. Next slide. Nathan Bedford Forrest was also involved in the same action at a battlefield called Parker's Crossroads in West Tennessee. If you're ever out towards Memphis, I highly recommend going to Parker's Crossroads. Next slide. On the Union side, Benjamin Grierson orchestrated a raid during the Vicksburg campaign that prevented the Confederate cavalry from interfering with Grant's crossing of the Mississippi River in 1863. Next slide. This fellow, John Hunt Morgan, a Kentuckian, launched a Christmas raid in 1862 that destroyed a portion of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad and interfered with William Stark Rosecrans's campaign in Middle Tennessee in 1862. Next slide. This fellow is Joe Wheeler, the boy general, who in 1863, next slide, launched a raid against the Union supply line that almost starved William Stark Rosecrans's army out of Chattanooga. Next slide. Now here in the East, of course, the great cavalry raider for the Confederates was Jeb Stuart, whose ride around McClellan in 1862 set the stage for the 7 Days battles. Stuart executed a deep penetration behind John Pope's line during the Second Manassas campaign. But of course, at Gettysburg, Stuart's raid deprived Lee of his eyes and ears, and some historians blame Stuart for the defeat at Gettysburg. Now, Jeb Stuart was wounded mortally at the Battle of Yellow Tavern in May of 1864. Next slide. And his replacement was this fellow, Wade Hampton. Hampton executed one of the most unusual and probably the most unusual cavalry raid in the history of the Civil War. It's known as the Beefsteak Raid. It occurred in September of 1864, and that's what I want to talk about this evening. And this brings us to the question of bread and meat. And I tell you, it was at this very time a serious matter. So wrote Private David Cardwell of the Confederate Horse Artillery, describing the state of the Army's rations in the late summer of 1864. Next slide. On August 22nd, 1864, General Lee reported that his supply of corn was exhausted. And a few weeks later, the chief commissary of the Army of Northern Virginia, Major S. Bassett French, admitted that the government had less than 15 days of meat to feed not only Lee's army, but the starving civilian populations of Richmond and Petersburg. The collection of meat from all sources during the past 30 days would not subsist the Army of Northern Virginia for 1 week, wrote French. Such desperate measures, this desperate situation, meant that there had to be some kind of an equally desperate measure to resolve it. Next slide. On September 3rd, Lee wrote Hampton, suggesting that his cavalry commander investigate the feasibility of executing a raid against the City Point area, which was the supply depot for the Union Army. At City Point and other points, his wagons are parked in the rear, wrote Lee. Lee hoped that Hampton would capture some of those wagons to help alleviate this really serious supply situation that faced the Army of Northern Virginia. In response, Hampton dispatched his collection of coon hunters and deer stalkers, known as the Iron Scouts, to execute Lee's orders. These military spies were led by a young Texan by the name of George D. Shadburn. I wish I had a picture of Shadburn, but we've not been able to find one. He was a member of a unit called the Jeff Davis Cavalry. Shadburn and his men spent most of their time exploring enemy dispositions by night, sometimes dressed in Union uniforms, and of course, risking capital punishment if they were captured so attired. After completing his clandestine reconnaissance on September the 5th, Shadburn sent Hampton a remarkably detailed report outlining the Union positions, their troop strength, and all of their military assets. Included in his report was mention of the existence of 3,000 head of cattle, attended, he said, quote, by 120 men and 30 citizens without arms at a place called Coggins Point, about 8 miles downriver from City Point on the James River. Now, of course, Shadburn had no authority to recommend operational decisions, but he did mention, quote, the greatest danger, I think, would be on Jerusalem Plank Road in returning. He also painstakingly described the road network leading to the herd and the relatively weak presence defending the cattle. Hampton, of course, could not miss Shadburn's suggestion and implication that those beeves would be ripe for the taking. The livestock, incidentally, was a part of Grant's supply system. They would bring herds of cattle by ship down to City Point, where they would then graze on green pastures and fatten up before they were slaughtered and distributed to the troops. And then a new shipment of cattle would come down and repeat the process. Next slide. Now, Union cavalry under this fellow, August Kautz, part of the Army of the James, bore responsibility for picketing the Union rear, including responsibility for the cattle's security. Kautz's small division was spread out, running from this Jerusalem Plank Road, and there'll be a map later that'll show you where that is, up to the James River, and had encountered really nothing more serious than the occasional guerrilla incursion, leading them to believe that their assignment was one without much danger. Now, Hampton, of course, grasped Shadburn's not so subtle suggestion and composed a letter to General Lee on September 8th proposing a raid on the Yankee cattle. Lee approved Hampton's idea the following day, but expressed concern about how Hampton might safely return to friendly lines, burdened with hundreds of beeves. He requested a meeting with Hampton. I have not been able to determine whether that meeting actually occurred, but in any event, by the 13th of September, Hampton had selected the force that he would use to attack the cattle herd. Next slide. Rudy Lee, General Lee's second son, would provide the bulk of the troops. He was a division commander. Fitz Lee, General Lee's nephew, was out in the Shenandoah Valley with his division. So Rudy Lee would have his two brigades, next slide, under J. Lucius Davis, next slide, and Rufus Barringer, Virginians and North Carolinians, respectively. Next slide. This fellow, Matthew Calbreth Butler, who had replaced Hampton in division command, would contribute one of his brigades under, next slide, this fellow, Tom Rosser, known as the Laurel Brigade, one of the most famous of the Confederate cavalry brigades. And about 100 troopers from Butler's other division under a man named Lovick Miller of the 6th South Carolina Cavalry. Next slide. James Deering, a Virginian, and in charge of the organic cavalry that was a part of PGT Beauregard's separate army there at Petersburg, would contribute his brigade. And next slide, there'd be two sections of artillery. That's a section is 2 guns. 2 sections of artillery under Edward Graham, commanding the Petersburg artillery. Next slide. And William McGregor, who was in charge of the Stuart horse artillery, both under, next slide, R. Preston Chew. Finally, a fellow named Lieutenant John R. Lanow, who was an engineer officer assigned to Hampton's cavalry, would select 80 members, makeshift pioneers, selected from all the rest of the brigades. Thus, somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 troopers would compose the force to attack the cattle. Shadburn, this remarkable young fellow, had somehow managed to corral a group of herding dogs that he brought with him as well. Now, Hampton faced 3 obvious challenges. First, what route would he take to get to the cattle herd to avoid the expanded Union lines south and west of Petersburg? Second, how in the world would he capture some 3,000 head of cattle quickly enough to overwhelm the Union defenders and defeat the inevitable Federal response? And thirdly, and as Lee indicated, most difficult assignment was how he would get back to friendly lines with this many cattle. Now, this drama unfolded on terrain that is, I'm sure, unfamiliar to almost all of you. And I've got a map, next slide, that I'm going to show on several occasions here to try to help you follow the geography. Now, happily, I will say as an aside, most of this area, with one exception, most of these roads still exist in rural Prince George County, Virginia, and you can, it would make a kind of an interesting tour to follow all of this. Now, Hampton, let's see if I can operate this. This is not working. Let me try this one. Yes. Hampton, here's Petersburg. Hampton would take the Boyden Plank Road southwest, in other words, away from the cattle herd, which is up here, and then take a country road leading southeast, cross very deep Rowanny Creek at a place called Wilkinson's Bridge, go across the Jerusalem Plank Road, this road here, go across the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad, and wind up at a place called Cook's Bridge over the Blackwater River. So the red lines are obviously the Confederate routes, and the blue lines, which we'll get to later, is going to represent the Union pursuit. Now, Shadburn had informed Hampton that Cook's Bridge had been destroyed. So Lanneau would have to rebuild that bridge as a part of the route. But of course, because the bridge was destroyed, Hampton assumed that the Yankees would not be guarding it because it was a destroyed bridge. And of course, he was right about that. The plan was that to split, once they got to Cook's Bridge, to split the force with one force heading right towards the cattle and the other two forces guarding the flanks to prevent the Union forces from converging on the Confederates there. Now, what about these cattle? A fellow named Captain Nathaniel A. Richardson was the commissary of subsistence, would unwittingly shorten the route for Hampton by moving the troops from Coggin's Point, which is here, 2 miles to the southwest at a place called the Harrison Farm, where there were greener pastures there. Richardson carefully reported that there were 2,486 head of cattle at the Harrison Farm. A cavalry guard of about 150 troopers from the 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry protected the cattle, which were described by Shadburn as, quote, all about the same color, a milk and cider, broad horns, and weighing about 900 pounds each, all steers. Now, only the senior officers knew Hampton's plan as the column headed out before dawn on September the 14th. And this is the route that they would take. And this is the order that they were in. Rooney Lee's troops in advance, Miller's small contingent behind them, the artillery there, Rosser's Laurel Brigade, Deering, and then the engineers would follow in the rear. The troopers thought that they were maybe after a brigade of United States colored troops, and some of them even thought they were heading to the Shenandoah Valley to join up with Fitz Lee. We had no intention or idea that Beeves had any place in the picture at all, wrote one of Chew's gunners. Hampton and Shadburn led the column. They camped that night just short of Wilkinson's Bridge down here on the Rowanee Creek. The troopers were back in the saddle at 5 a.m. on the 15th, crossing the Jerusalem Plank Road and the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad before reaching Cook's Bridge. On the way, they passed on Jerusalem Plank Road. They passed this little mill, destroyed mill, owned by a man named Belchus, who was 47 years old and would play a role in the campaign. He would actually join up with the troopers to supplement Shadburn's local knowledge of the terrain. About mid-afternoon, the column reached Cook's Bridge. Now it was Lanneau's troops who had to go to work. And Lanneau said that he had selected men, quote, accustomed to the use of the axe. And they began immediately cutting down trees, making planks, and by dusk, they had fashioned a rude bridge over the existing piers on Cook's Bridge, about 100 feet long. It took until after midnight for the entire Confederate column to cross that bridge. And now the column would split into the 3 parts to execute their movement. They went to this little place called Laurel Springs all together, and then they marched up to this point here at Lawyers Road. At this point, Rooney Lee's 2 brigades would go up Lawyers Road and adapt a blocking position on this major road called the Powhatan Stage Road, because here at Prince George Courthouse was the largest of the Union reserve troops. And so Rooney Lee's job was to block those troops from interfering with the raid. The rest of the forces went north for a couple of more miles, and then Rosser and Miller took off on this road here going north, while Deering followed Hines Road and would take a position here near a place called Cox Mill, where about 150 members of the 1st District of Columbia Cavalry were located. The closest Federals to the cattle were up here at a place called Sycamore Church. There were about 250 members of the 1st District of Columbia Cavalry there. Behind them was a small contingent of the 11th Pennsylvania Cavalry. So that's what they were up against. So they split into those 3 different locations. Deering's job, just like Rooney Lee's, would be to block, first of all, to get rid of this 150-man detachment at Cox Mill, and then block the road leading to Fort Powhatan on the James, because there was another Federal contingent at Fort Powhatan. So you see what Hampton's strategy was. A third of the cavalry goes after the cattle, a third of it blocks the Federals coming in from the east, and a third of it blocks the Federals coming in from the west. A very complicated plan that required a lot of different timing. All right. No rest for the Confederates on the night of the 15th and 16th. They, as soon as they got across Cook's Bridge, they began approaching their various assignments here. Now let's talk about Rosser and Miller, the fellows who were going after the cattle. They approached Sycamore Church and stopped about 3:30 a.m. in the pitch black, where they were about half a mile from the Union encampment. Now that Union encampment had a lone sentry out in front, and then what they call a picket reserve, which would be about 20 to 30 men behind the lone sentry. The rest of the Yankees would be asleep in their bivouacs. The man who was responsible for that contingent, next slide, is this fellow, Major J. Stannard Baker. Now, the 1st District of Columbia Cavalry is an interesting outfit. It was mostly recruited from sea-going men from Maine, men who had absolutely no familiarity with horses whatsoever. They were a joke when they first were recruited, but by 1864, they had become fairly decently disciplined cavalry. And the thing about the 1st District Cavalry was they were armed with 16-shot Henry rifles. Okay, now Baker, let's go next slide, please. Oops, let's go back one. Let's go back to the map if we can. There you go. Baker had obstructed the road leading to Sycamore Church, so there was only a narrow pathway wide enough for one horseman to go through. So how are they going to deal with this? Now, Shadburn volunteered to lead 200 of his dismounted troopers by accessing a ravine that led toward the Union camp, but Tom Rosser objected. Shadburn will fail, says Rosser. The enemy will be awakened before he can reach them. Rosser preferred, if you know anything about Tom Rosser, this is in character for him, a traditional mounted charge. I will take them quickly, he promised, and Hampton approved, but Hampton warned him, let the blood and the mistake, if such it be yours. Now, Rosser would select the Bath Squadron of his brigade, which consisted of companies F and G of the 11th Virginia Cavalry under a fellow named Lieutenant Andrew Gatewood, to ride quickly toward that Union sentry. And they said, if that sentry fires, you fire back at him, and then the 7th Virginia Cavalry will come charging in afterwards. So this is what happened. Now, it's just barely dawn, so you have to imagine it's almost pitch black still. And as the Bath Squadron goes ahead, the vedette sees what's coming, and he doesn't fire. He turns around and rides off. pretty sensible. But Gatewood's men fired at him, which then alerted the picket reserve and indeed probably alerted everybody in the main camp as well. That meant that those picket reserves began firing at the Confederates with their 16-shot Henrys, while the 12th Virginia Cavalry was, as rapidly as possible, dismantling all of the obstructions so they could mount a mounted attack. And they were able to do so. The Confederates managed to open the roadway, allowing the 12th to charge into the groggy Bluecoats, who attempted to resist unsuccessfully this entirely unexpected intrusion. 219 of the 250 men of the 1st District Cavalry surrendered, including the commander, Major Baker, who surrendered in dishabille. And for those of you from South Carolina, that means he didn't have his clothes on. The fight was over in 30 minutes. Now the cattle herd was only 2 miles away. Next slide, and one more after that. This is Captain Henry H. Gregg, who led that portion of the 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry guarding the herd. And of course, he was listening rather intently to this unexpected combat to his southwest. Its origin was revealed when a few fugitives from the 1st District Cavalry dashed into Gregg's camp with word of the rebel attack. Gregg had barely enough time to organize his troops when Rosser's lead element, the 35th Virginia Battalion, known as the Comanches, appeared on the horizon, joined by the 11th and 12th Virginia Cavalry. Rosser ordered Private Cary Selden of the 12th Virginia to ride forward with a white flag at the point of his saber to demand the surrender of these outnumbered Federals. A fellow named Sergeant Alfred Kenyon came out to meet Selden and apparently, in rather colorful language, told him to go to hell. Selden returned, told Rosser what Kenyon's message was, and Rosser turns to, next slide, this fellow, Captain Elijah White, Lieutenant Colonel rather, Elijah White of the Comanches, and said simply, "Come down on them, White." The Virginians charged with a yell, scattering the outgunned Union resistance in about 5 minutes. But Captain Richardson, that commissary, had prepared for just such an emergency and ordered his drovers to open the corral and drive away the cattle. The enemy came up shouting and firing with great vehemence, reported Richardson, exhibiting their usual barbarity by shooting down the unarmed herders, stabbing them after they lay helpless on the ground, stripping and robbing them. But the herders had managed to throw down the corral and by shooting pistols and yelling Indian fashion, scattered the cattle. Rosser dispatched his newly arrived 7th Virginia to gallop ahead of the herd, but he admitted this was not easily obeyed, for the young steers ran like buffalo, and it was requiring too much of a jaded cavalry to force it into a race like this. Next slide. Fortunately for the rustlers, the steers eventually expended their energy, and with the help of Shadburn's herding dogs, the Confederates gained control. In our brigade were quite a number of cowboys, not of the Texas or Western sort, but real Virginia cowboys who knew the habits and dispositions of cattle, reported a member of the 12th Virginia. Captain Gregg was among the Pennsylvanians captured, and by 8 a.m., the purloined beeves were on their way to Cook's Bridge. Next slide. All right, so what about these flanking maneuvers? First of all, let's take a look at Deering up here. Deering arrives at Cox Mill, and about, I don't know, maybe 400 yards or so, and you can see that terrain today. There was something of a hill, and William Howe, the captain of the 1st District Cavalry in charge of that 150-man detachment, set up a small fortification on top of that hill. Deering attacked them in front, and those fellows leveled those 16-shot Henrys at Deering's men and drove them back. But then Deering decided he would try to outflank them And of course, he was able to do that and quickly scattered those 150 men. A lot of them rode towards Sycamore Church, expecting that their buddies would be there at Sycamore Church. And when they got there, they saw a bunch of fellows in blue uniforms, but they happened to be Confederates who had traded in their tattered uniforms for Union blue. And so as they rode into the camp, they were all captured. So Deering had done his job very well. He also cut the telegraph line between Fort Powhatan and City Point, which meant that the garrison at Fort Powhatan had no idea what was going on. And so they were neutralized. Now, on Rooney Lee's front, here's Rooney Lee. He is riding forward. He reaches the Powhatan Stage Road and sets up a block right in here. But the 3rd New York Cavalry, a whole regiment of Union cavalry, was at Prince George Courthouse, and they counterattacked. Lee fell back to number 3 on the map here, the intersection of Lawyers Road and the Powhatan Stage Road, and deployed 2 of those pieces of artillery with him behind a makeshift barrier, and was able to hold off the Federals until word arrived from Hampton that the cattle were under control. And that meant that there would be a rendezvous down here at Cook's Bridge. Deering would fall back, and so would Lee. A rendezvous at Cook's Bridge. Hampton would report that as soon as the attack was made at the church, General Lee on the left, General Deering on the right, attacked the enemy successfully and established themselves rapidly, firmly at the points they were ordered to return. Rosser, followed by Deering and Lee, made for Cook's Bridge, and the herd reached the Blackwater River about 10 in the morning. Next slide. Hampton assigned this fellow, Major Andrew R. Venable, to command the escort managing the captured beeves. These men received valuable assistance from some of Richardson's experienced herders, who, in the words of one Confederate, served their new masters as well and apparently as readily as if these had been their original employers, although watchful troopers always rode alongside with a handy weapon to ensure loyalty. These drovers wisely divided the herd into smaller groups, which were much easier to control. And when the beeves began crossing Llano's makeshift bridge over the Blackwater River or swimming across, Shadburn and Venable carefully tallied 2,486 head, exactly the number that Richardson had reported 2 days earlier. Once everything and everyone was across the river, Llano's men destroyed the bridge and left the 2nd North Carolina Cavalry on the west bank just to keep an eye on things. Now, in order to put extra miles between the bullocks and the bluecoats, next slide, please, Hampton ordered the herd to move about 2 miles south of the major retreat route, following this dotted red line here. At a place called Hawkinsville and Newville. The herd then crossed the Nottoway River down here at Freeman's Ford, and were on the other bank of the river by late in the afternoon. Now, en route, the herd passed a modest home that was occupied in part by a young girl named Margaret Donnan, who watched in amazement as thousands of these cattle bellowed past her home. Spotting the only cow in the herd, as the story goes, losing my headset here, Margaret asked the kindly Venable if she could have the cow. Now, as the story goes, Venable said that the cow was reserved for General William Mahone to provide fresh milk to that general's famously peculiar palate. But the child's request had touched a spot in Venable's heart, and he picked one of the worn out steers and gave it to Margaret. With Cook's Bridge destroyed, Hampton recognized that the most likely avenue of Union pursuit would be down the Jerusalem Plank Road. And so he ordered the Comanches to go forward and select a position of defense across that road. All right, now what about the Union reaction to all of this? Couts first notified the cavalry headquarters at 6 in the morning of a slight action between a place called Mount Sinai Church, which is here on the map, and the Powhatan Stage Road. But he dismissed this as just a retaliation for an earlier cavalry skirmish. An hour later, however, he reported the Confederate presence at the Stage Road, and he feared for the safety of his detachment at Sycamore Church. Not until 7:30 did Couts learn of the capture of the 1st District Cavalry, lamenting that I have no force to resist a serious attack. An hour later, that's 30 minutes after the cattle were plodding towards Cook's Bridge, Couts finally learned the extent of the raid. Now, to his credit, he organized a pursuit with his 2 available regiments, the 3rd New York and the 11th Pennsylvania Cavalry, not yet understanding the strength or whereabouts of the Confederates. And again, this blue line represents Couts's pursuit. Now, he had about 500 to 700 troopers. They moved to Sycamore Church, number 1 on your map, where the remnants of the 1st District Cavalry joined in, and joined by a couple of pieces of artillery, Couts began his serious pursuit about 12:30 in the afternoon. He reached Cook's Bridge shortly after its destruction, while the North Carolinians on the far bank taunted the Bluecoats by bellowing like cattle and facetiously inviting the Yankees to come over across the river and retrieve the herd. It took hours for Couts to rebuild the bridge at Cook's Bridge, and about 10 o'clock, Couts caught up with the Confederate rear guard down here around Newville, in this area here. But it was dark, and he realized that he didn't have enough men to really do anything. His troopers were exhausted, and after some skirmishing, he stopped the action there. Now, George Meade, who was in charge of all the Union troops because Grant was absent at that time, meeting with Phil Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley. Meade learned of the raid by about 7:40 in the morning, although details were still sketchy. Next slide, please. He immediately ordered this fellow, General Henry Davies, who in the absence of David Gregg was in charge of all the Union cavalry, to, quote, get together all your available force and attack the parties to endeavor to recover the cattle. It would take time, but Davis managed to put together about 2,100 men from his scattered brigades and took off south down the Jerusalem Plank Road. And here's Davies moving down the road. Now, by 2 p.m., the Federals had begun to engage those advanced troops of the Comanches, who gradually fell back to their main position, which was right near Belch's mill. It was a very good position. The mill pond protected his left flank. Swampy ground, impassable to normal travel, protected his right. There was a stream in front of the position, crossed by a rickety corduroy bridge on the Jerusalem Plank Road. Rosser now arrived with the rest of the Laurel Brigade and expanded the flanks beyond what the Comanches had done and left a mounted force on the hill behind the bridge. Davies arrives, unlimbers his artillery, and there's a spirited artillery duel between the Yankee guns and Chew's artillery there. This prompted Rosser to call for reinforcements, and Deering's brigade shows up, and part of Rooney Lee's brigade shows up as well. We made haste to reach Rosser, rode a lieutenant in the 9th Virginia Cavalry, sometimes at a trot, sometimes at a gallop, and at full speed came into the line of battle just as the sun went down. Davies would launch a dismounted attack, which was repulsed. He then began repeating his artillery bombardment. Then he launched a mounted attack, which got within about 100 yards of the Confederate position, but that was also repulsed. Then Davies, by now almost completely dark, deploys 3 of his cavalry regiments on the east side of the road, 2 of them on the west side, and launches a 3rd attack. The 1st Massachusetts Cavalry actually got within the Confederate lines and fought hand to hand, but eventually the Confederates were successful. Who was there that can ever forget the wild grandeur of that scene? Asked one Southerner. The sun shedding its parting beams upon the battling hosts, the heavy plunging of the shot and shell through the ranks of men and horses, the waving of battle flags, the galloping of staff officers and couriers over the field, the defiant shouts of our men calling to the Yankees to come and get some beef for supper, all made up a scene strangely mingling the sublime and the ridiculous. At 8 o'clock, Davies decided to break contact. The enemy were in large force, he wrote, and occupied a position too strong to be taken by the force of my command. Now, Davies simply hoped that he could pin the Confederates in place until Kautz could come in on their rear. But as we know, Kautz was miles away at this point, still trying to repair Cook's Bridge. And in any event, he didn't have enough men to do any good. And so by 10 o'clock that night, when Davies saw no help from Kautz, he withdrew. And the fighting that was widespread on September 16th, 1864, came to an end. Hampton left a small force at Ebenezer Church, which is right there at Velch's Mill, and remounted the bulk of his command, crossing Rowanny Creek at Wilkinson's Bridge and camping in the same place that they had used 2 days earlier. Now, for General Kautz and his 700 men, they spent a very uncomfortable night in a makeshift camp east of the Ebenezer Church battlefield. We had nothing to eat and no blankets, reported Kautz. His enervated riders probed forward to Jerusalem Plank Road and found neither the Confederates nor Davies. The command, having been hastily turned out to repel an attack, was not prepared, he said, for so long a march, and I thought it prudent to return. They were back in their camps by 1 p.m. General Meade communicated with Davies before dawn on the 17th, advising that no effort should be spared to recapture the cattle so long as there's any chance to do so, adding that when in your judgment nothing further can be done, you can return. Davies dispatched a brigade of about 500 men. They crossed the Weldon Railroad, which is this railroad here, but they discovered that not only were the Confederates gone and the cattle were beyond reach, but the rumor was that Hampton had 6,000 men with him. And so Davies did the obvious thing, and he went back to camp as well. The next day, the Beeves completed their journey to Petersburg, where, due to a lack of feed for such a large herd, the cattle met its intended fate. That same day, the proceeds from the raid began being distributed to the men. We are enjoying the luxury of fresh beef, which General Hampton transferred from Grant's commissary to ours, boasted the Georgia artillerist. Now, the butchering took place in a large field just outside of Petersburg. I found this interesting anecdote, and try to imagine this now. A soldier in the 1st Confederate Engineers passed the place on his way back to camp. I asked if they would sell me some of the trimmings, which are usually the butcher's share of the beef when it's killed, he explained. The bloodshedders offered to sell him a head for $5. Dirt cheap, was my thought, wrote the engineer. It was a pretty bloody and ill-shaped load, but I tackled it in order to take my mess some fresh meat. I took the head by the long horns and placed it face down on my head. When his unorthodox millinery arrived in camp, the men of his mess expressed great elation and proposed to make a night of it. The commissary department directed the beef to be distributed every other day. A Richmond editor estimated that the steers averaged 800 pounds, and by multiplying that by 2,486, arrived at an aggregate weight of 1,988,800 pounds, enough to feed 50,000 men a pound each for 40 days. The soldiers were very glad to substitute beef for the bacon ration that had provided any of the protein that they had eaten for the last several months. Having been eating pork so long, I am really ashamed to look a hog in the face, wrote one Confederate private. A Georgia soldier informed his sister in a letter home, at the sight of such fine beef, my appetite became as keen as a razor. And you can imagine me with a long rib in one hand and a hoe cake in the other, face almost greased ear to ear. I tell you, I never enjoyed a piece of beef so much. And now the beef supply lasted through the middle of October, prompting one officer to complain, Yankee beef for breakfast, Yankee beef for dinner. Really, we have been eating so much beef and I'm getting tired of it. Now, Hampton counted 2,468 head at Petersburg, meaning that the 18 missing cattle that Couts claimed to have recovered made up for the difference. In addition to the rations, the herd provided hides for leather, producing much needed shoes. Hampton's raid captured 304 Union prisoners, adding to the bounty of the raid, all at a cost to the Confederates of 10 killed, 47 wounded, and 4 missing. And as you can imagine, the raid generated great praise in the Southern newspapers. General Lee offered Hampton his profound thanks for another to the list of important services rendered by the cavalry during the present campaign. Now, as you might imagine, the reaction in the Union Army was somewhat different. Next slide. General Benjamin Butler, the commander of the Army of the James, placed the value of the beeves at $2 million and called the affair an enormous blunder. Next slide. Grant's new military secretary, Eli S. Parker, a Seneca Indian chief, thought the raid had, quote, a very bad look against us and cannot be easily explained. Next slide. Lieutenant Colonel Michael R. Morgan, the chief commissary of subsistence, recalled that when Grant returned to City Point and learned the particulars of the raid, he said it was one of 3 times when I saw from his face he was troubled, that things had not gone to his satisfaction. But, added Morgan, he got over it and would say facetiously in this connection, I have the best commissary of any of these armies. He not only feeds my troops, but feeds the enemy as well. Of course, the Federals went without beef for quite a while until a new shipment could arrive at City Point or Coggins Point. And a Maine soldier lamented, we don't relish this, for we have yet to see the time when we had too much beef. But not all the Yankees felt that way. A private in the 147th Pennsylvania named Charles Biddicombe wrote home and said, we shall be short of beef ration, and that would be terrible very. The beef is so good, so fat, so tender. That is, if you call nail rods and India rubber tender. The beef will kill more Rebs than we shall with bullets. If it don't, their stomachs are capable of digesting pig lead and tin scraps. Now, a disaster of this magnitude, of course, required someone to be held accountable. And Couts thought that General Meade, next slide, please, would be the one to blame. And Meade wrote to his wife that Grant's absence and the usual friendly spirit of the press will undoubtedly attribute this loss to me, being sarcastic, because Meade and the press did not get along. But in reality, folks, the Beefsteak Raid was due less to Union failure and more to the skill with which it was planned and executed. First, Shadburn provided all the information required to attempt such a risky undertaking. Secondly, Hampton moved quickly and stealthily ensuring that he would surprise his adversaries. And finally, the gray-clad troopers acquitted themselves well in combat at Sycamore Church, Cox Mill, along the Powhatan Stage Road, and at Ebenezer Church. The Beefsteak Raid more than validated Lee's decision to advance Hampton to be in charge of the cavalry. As a North Carolinian observed after the raid, Hampton is fast proving himself equal, if not superior, to Stuart. Now, the Confederate soldiers on picket spent less time debating credit or blame for the raid than they did in taunting their blue-clad opponents. They periodically broke into loud moos. And at other times, they would simply yell, beef, 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 or ask the opposing picket, have you seen anything of our cow? For the first few days after the raid, the Federals would reply to these taunts with cries of Atlanta, Atlanta. But after September 19th, with the Union victory at 3rd Winchester, a soldier in the 121st New York phrased it, the joke was on the other side, for our men could offer to trade their captured cattle for Early's battle flags and guns. Last slide. So in the final analysis, Hampton's Beefsteak Raid really had little impact on the overall course of the Petersburg campaign. Shortly thereafter, the Federals began their 5th Petersburg offensive that captured a great deal of territory north of the James and extended the Union lines to the southwest of Petersburg, placing another nail in the coffin of the Army of Northern Virginia. But I hope you will agree that for sheer gall and daring, the Beefsteak Raid takes its place among the most spectacular episodes of the entire Civil War. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, sounds like it's working this week, for this month. We're going into our, you're not? Now we got it. I'm hearing the echo. Thank you for that
You're welcome.
great discussion of the Beefsteak Raid. Now you made me hungry. I'm going to have to see what's open now that I can stop on the way home and get some good beef. We now have our regular Q&A. We've got the microphone here. If you want to come up, please, and use that to ask a question. Otherwise, raise your hand and I will bring the mic around. I will start out asking the question, the success of the Beefsteak Raid, did that engender any other attempts to try to do other raids to gather supplies?
The question is, did this engender any other attempts for raids? No, it engendered a great deal of more attention by the Union forces to security. If any of you have been to City Point, I imagine some of you have been to City Point, you might have remembered on the way there was a big fort there. That was one of 8 Union forts that were built as a direct result of the Beefsteak Raid. So they were very sensitive now to the potential of Confederates getting in behind their lines, and Grant ordered a great deal of improvements to the defense. So something like this could never happen again because the Federals had beefed up, no pun intended, their defenses.
Well done. Any other questions? Yes.
About how many miles were the cattle driven from the point where they were taken to the Confederate line?
I think you were a little muffled. You asked about how many miles did they travel? It was about 55 miles altogether up to the cattle herd, the way that they went, and about 50 miles on the way back. So these fellows in 2.5 days rode 105 miles. You know, one of the things that we sometimes overlook when we read about Civil War history is the logistics and the physical effort that was required to execute something like this. If you can imagine riding that far in that short amount of time, always on the QV for danger ahead of you, you have some appreciation for the magnitude of this raid. So it was about 105 miles total of riding. But of course, each of those three segments had a little bit different route, but averaged a little over 100 miles.
Any other questions that we have here?
Well, everybody's anxious to go home and see the results of the election, which I'm here to tell you, you're not going to hear
Thank
about it
you.
until that Friday.
It's one. Yes, we do have.
I'm just curious in terms of preservation of all that beef. What did they do? Because I know they could have salted it, but it just seems like an awful lot of how they could possibly have utilized all that. beef.
Right. And that's why they started issuing it right away. By the time the beef was exhausted, it was pretty rancid. Yeah, it was, and that quote I read to you from Private Biddlecom would suggest that some of this issued beef was something that you and I would never try to touch. It was so bad. But if you were starving, you could overlook some smelly beef to fill your stomach. I'm not being sarcastic. I mean, these guys ate it up because they were in pretty bad shape for supplies. But you're right. Your premise of your question is correct.
Anything else that we have? Thank you, Will.
Thank you
for
very
a great
much.
speech.
Appreciate it.
Two things. If you're interested in the Moore Kunstler calendar, we have the gentleman here to sign up, and we have also, I believe, outside in the registration area, the sign up for the tour of Fort Fisher in January. So please look at both of those. Thank you.